Let me just look.
Fantastic, and thanks for joining. This is the 10th Big Picture webinar. The theme is building your team around the customer. Fantastic. What a great backdrop, Tim. I love something to react to. Whenever I watch these recordings back, it's much more fun.
Snail. It's the snail.
It is. It's great. Just start throwing things about. If you've got a jacket.
And when I lifted this up early to show you, and I realised it wasn't on camera. Anyway.
Already the best start to the webinar I've ever had at number 10 by Tim displaying his red Crocs. And this is the kind of thing we like. We like to react to things. We like to put things out there that people can do something with. And it's a little bit of a connection now to big picture. We're all at different levels, and this is really an insight into how big picture and my related experience come to bear. And I love to help people out. And the idea is that I and my business provides businesses and people like yourselves with the skills and the resources to either go out and do this kind of thing yourself with my help, or I can come and help you, or some of my practitioners can come and help you. We're all at different levels. So I'm going to give you a bit of an insight, hopefully trigger some thoughts. And it's all about building your team around the customer. We're using Zoom. We've all been in a tech test in advance. We've lost a couple of people because they can't get in, but that's fine. They can watch the recording, and I'm getting pings all over the place because people can't get in, but that's fine. We're here, so we'll focus on us. It's quite fast paced. It's intended to be so. And it's all about making and doing and following along. So you've got a piece of paper and a pen in front of you. You may have the prop. You may have some sample kit. People who are watching the recording sometimes have bought the big picture sample kit, so they can actually follow along using the big symbols behind me and the poker chips. It's all intended to look at a specific topic, which is building the team around the customer. It's about putting the customer at the heart of the business. Now, this is a more straightforward theme for me, because within big picture, as we work through this, the customer is threaded with the yellow line right across the page. And this is about giving people the resources so they can have their own conversations and make connections themselves. And the customer is right through the center of big picture. Now, I know it's a principle that a lot of businesses say we want to put the customer at the heart of what we do. I see that in principle, but often I see less practical ways of doing that, particularly that involve the team and engage them in doing so. So they either say it as a throwaway comment and don't try to practice it, or they do practice it by kind of telling people. But what big picture is all about is putting the customer right at the center and building the team around it and giving them something actually to do. And what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to give you an example today of a business I'm going to model the idea on. But what I'd like you to do, if you've got a client in mind or your own business, feel free to kind of apply the thinking to that and don't follow along with my example. And then we'll get a kind of compare and contrast, which we may have time at the end to kind of share, and there'll be a bit of a follow-up as to what you can go off and do with that. So whilst I'm giving you my related experience in kind of 3 points, just maybe think about a client or customer that you can use, whether it's your own business or one that you help, because we're all in different situations. When you're doing so, think about who you provide value to. So who is the customer, who is the client? And that's a key thing with big picture. If we're going to build the team around the customer, it's really important to know what the purpose of that business is, who the customer or client is, and who the value is provided to. And Lisa and I just had a free chat, and it made me realize that sometimes that isn't always obvious to people. They may call them a client, a customer. And what I would say is, even mulling that over with your team and discussing it with others is an interesting conversation in itself. And what I would say is, always think about who the output is for, who the value is created for. And that's always a really good clue as to who the customer or client is. I think we'll start with 3 related points of related experience. We'll then go on to a start, middle and end of the practical exercise, and hopefully we'll finish promptly just after 1/2 past because we started a little bit later. So related experience, points 1, 2 and 3. Point 1, it's about smashing this hierarchical way of thinking for a business. So you've got an organization chart with the senior management team at the top and the middle management. And if we look at that, I'll show you a little visual in a minute how it's about smashing that apart, because the customer doesn't really see, as a second point, those cross boundaries in the business. What the customer wants is a continuous experience throughout their period through which they enjoy the value of their product or service. So it's really, what's interesting for me as an analyst at heart is, internally you see a hierarchical structure, because that's how businesses are organized. And of course there are benefits for that have stood the test of time, which is, it's a great way to structure a business so everybody knows what they're doing internally. But in some cases it's a bit indulgent, because it doesn't actually help the customer experience. So sometimes it's good to flip that thinking and see how the customer is threaded through left to right across the page. Next thing is kind of smashing those business area boundaries. So we'll go on to looking at that, and actually looking at the different steps along the customer journey, and not all of those steps are equal. So what I mean by that is, the customer goes through a broad range of touch points and experience. And when we're working with teams and businesses, it's really interesting, once you've broken open those boundaries, to think about the moods, the experiences, all the different types of touch points. And often that's delivered in ways that we don't always imagine, whether it's through formal direct marketing and advertising, whether it's through an exceptional call to customer services. And what sometimes we forget, all those touch points form a basis of that kind of customer experience from front to back. And I'll just open it up at this point. Is there any experience you've got that kind of relates to that in a business that you might be thinking about before we get into the practical exercise?
I think there are a couple, Martin. So one is whether you step back and just, the classic customer supplier thing, and actually Webmart, who I really like as a business, they see their suppliers as 10 times more important than the customers. So it even turns that concept on its head. And it's this idea that internally in your market, you've got customer suppliers because you've got information. If you treat your colleagues as customers, looked after them as well, that would then model or emphasize the customer experience going outside to your ultimate customers. So to an extent, we need to break down and challenge the old model thinking, like it's us and them, and it's together for a shared goal.
And I think maybe the thing that binds that together is the fact it's a human experience for either the customer and the employee. And I think a lot has been written about that at the moment, that it's not just having a job so much as people want more now. The workplace is changing. It's all about that experience of coming to work as an employee. And there's massive amounts around employee engagement and the social enterprise and all of those references, and also the experience. And it's wonderful in effect, because it's actually reminding us that we're all human and people at the end of the day, and we need to be treated and worked in a certain way. And then all the measures and the profit and everything else kind of comes into that. So that's lovely. Thanks for that. If at any point in any of you do want to kind of make a point, there's a little chat window to the right. If you just kind of pop that up and just ask me to kind of pause, because often I realize when there's a few of us in the chat, I don't know quite who might have a point. If you do want to share something, just put your hand up and just let me know. But thanks for that, Tim. So we'll get into the practical exercise. Thinking about that business that you've got, I just want to share with you something, a little visual on screen, which comes back to this kind of changing the way you think about the company that you might be looking at. So here's a kind of, you'll recognize if you just focus on the black text for now. I'm going to use a furniture maker for this. It's kind of furniture company that I worked with a few years ago, but it just reminded me of an example. They use kind of bespoke furniture, and actually the task we had was to look at how we could do exactly this, to build their team around the customer. I've got the organization at the top. I've kind of not used anything specific regarding the company for obvious reasons, but we've got a sales team on the left, a marketing team, an operations team, and a customer care team. And there were various other teams as well, but I've simplified it down. The point I'm making is here, when we looked at it, is that the customer there, which I've indicated with the yellow symbols and the yellow lines, was kind of quite difficult to spot a continual path through the business, because the customer was popping up in marketing. The marketing team had a view of the customer. The sales team had a view. Operations, i.e. the factory, they had a view of the customer. And this furniture business had a big emphasis on design. They wanted the customer to be part of the design process, but the frustration was that by the time they got into the factory, a lot of expectations had already been set through the marketing and sales process, so it didn't actually join up. And then, of course, if they need to go through customer care, then there's another touch point there. So if I just move forward to the next one, what if you just look at your prop in front of you, or if you're just doing it by like DIY, I want you to think about this. For me, this is my furniture company. It's a bespoke designed home accessory type business in terms of a purpose. And they put great emphasis on the design experience and the customer being involved with that. So if you imagine using big picture, using these facilitation techniques, we would pull as many people in the business together. And what we would do, this is kind of a simplified prop, we would give them a chance to be part of a conversation around how are we going to grow the team around the customer. And we would start by taking the hierarchy, smash it apart, and actually lay out the customer journey from left to right across the page. So just for a minute, just have a look down at your paper, and maybe for a business that you're thinking about, all you need to do is put the name in the top left. You can follow along with mine if you like, if you find it easier. Write in the purpose at the top. And then in this simplified form of the prop, I have the marketing team, the factory, and the customer care laid out left to right, with this spear running left to right, which is the yellow customer journey line. And we're going to focus in a little bit on that. And you can see I've cut out the team symbol, and I've just put it for now in we were focusing on the kind of factory area of the business at this point. So just kind of have a little doodle and follow along. I'll just have a little slurp of my water as before we continue. This is where knowledge of the purpose of the business, which we put at the top, and who your customer is something we would stop and get as right as we can at this point, because even if you're not using big picture, there are certain principles at play here, which is it's good to know the purpose of the business and any core values. It's good to understand the culture, and it's really important to understand who your customer and client is. So we might stop at this point, and on the left hand side of the big picture resource, we would do some customer segmentation, understanding who the customer is that we actually provide value to. Now, what we're going to move on to before we start growing the team out from the customer journey, and you can see that customer line going across the page, before we start growing that team out in a lot of different respects, what we're going to do is to better understand the steps along that customer journey. Now, the way we do that is that we come up with if you just have a little think about the different steps that customer goes through, and we actually write that on the customer journey. So if you're doing your own example, what I'd have a think about is think about the different steps that customer goes through. So in this case, it's a marketing team, a factory, and a customer care. If you're a consultant, you'll have your own kind of path for that. If you provide a product and a service, that will have a kind of different feel to it. But what I'm trying to get out here, and what we encourage us to do, is to something like this I've got on screen, what we do on one of the bigger formats of the big picture kit. Or you could just do it on flip charts and post-its if you like, but what we do is step out the customer journey. Now, remembering if we're building a team around the customer, we have to fully understand who the customer is, and you have to really have a conversation around the different steps of that customer journey. So what I've set out here is a kind of the customer becomes aware of this furniture company. There's a kind of informing and trust angle to it. There are so many fantastic conversations you can have around this kind of customer journey. Before you start growing the team out, you actually get the customer journey in play. We've then got, you'll notice at the center of the page here, we've got a consume kind of pattern, and we'll focus in on that a little bit in a minute. That consume pattern is where the value is added for as long a period as possible. This creates a really healthy conversation, because generally in a business, keeping the customer in that high value loop at the center of the page is a really significant and important step to understand. And sometimes teams and individuals within a business don't always think in that way if they haven't got a business development background. And what this is doing, instead of telling them this, what they're doing is they're finding out for themselves. So facilitating a session in this way allows them to kind of self-find, have conversations between themselves and their peers. And when you get to the end of the big picture path, they'll get onto the challenges and opportunities. You'll see towards the right-hand side, we've got a kind of, they've finished enjoying the product or service. There's a kind of passive phase, and then there's some feedback maybe asked for. If we take that further, I've just moved it on a little bit, which is, there's also a kind of returning loop, which is part of the big picture approach, which is, yes, they've enjoyed the product or service, you provided them with value, whoever that customer or client is. They then maybe break that transaction, and you want them really to come back. This is about your returning customers and your referrals. So really building a team around the customer starts with breaking the hierarchy and representing a different view of the business, where the customer journey is fully and wholly understood in terms of the different phases. And I'll just, before I pause for a thought there, I've zoomed in on the center of the page here. There's, for me, a really important pattern, which is keeping the customer at the center. And I haven't written it on because I didn't want to clutter it, but there's the design element of this furniture store was really interwoven into this high value loop. They found that by including the customer in the design element of what goes on in the factory, they found that was why customers were coming to them, as opposed to going to a ready-made, off-the-shelf, so to speak, to use a furniture metaphor, experience. So this is just zooming down. So I'll just pause there for a moment in terms of an experience or relating to how you understand the customer journey. Kind of how easy or hard would that be for the kind of customer that you're thinking about? Lisa, I don't know if you have a view.
Well, yeah, I mean, as we talked about earlier, from my point of view, it's difficult for me to establish actually who my customer is. So I've looked at it from the point of view of one of our suppliers, because I work in construction. So I've been just thinking about who the customer is for the construction company, and about the customer satisfaction. It's got to be really threefold. Is that it's the business themselves. So the construction company, they've got to be satisfied with what's being delivered. There's also the customer, which is me from the public sector point of view. And then thirdly, it's the end user, because a lot of what I do is in infrastructure and economic regeneration. It's then the general public. So it's really, I suppose the big question has been, who actually is the customer? And how do you then engage with them throughout the process, and the importance of the staff and the team within that. So yeah, it's interesting just thinking a bit more widely about it.
And I think the idea is here, by having the conversation, firstly you instigate the thought, because I think this is thinking about it maybe a bit too deeply, but I see it like this. We all like questions. We've got like two different parts of the brain. We all like questions that have got an easy answer to them. And it would be lovely to think you go into work every day and everybody walking through that front door has a clear view who the customer is. But what I find when I'm trying to help a business, you ask 10 people in that business who the customer or client is, and they offer you something a bit like you said, Lisa. But the guys over there and the ladies over there maybe have a different view. And it's about getting it out there in a way that doesn't make them feel belittled or ashamed that they don't quite know the answer. But if you give them the right props and the way to express themselves, then what they'll do, they'll have a go. It's a bit like learning a foreign language. You have a go and get it over the net, and then someone else will like hit it back. And soon as someone else hits it back, you have a connection and probably a better understanding and less fearful that you probably should keep it to yourself because you don't really know. And I find it incredible. A lot of businesses will have differing views about their purpose, their core values, maybe, but predominantly their customer and who they're actually delivering to. And you don't really stand much chance to build a team and a culture around the customer if you don't have that clarity. And it's about conversation and clarity. There's kind of lots of C words in it. So I like the way you've explained that, because when it came up in our pre-chat, I want to give you an obvious answer because that's my little chimp brain going, but actually I think maybe it's because it's a hard question and we don't all know the same answers to it. So anyway, I digress.
Yeah, I think it's different because it's public sector.
Yeah.
It's just a different way of looking at it than if you're in the private sector and your customer chain is a bit more obvious.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, we'll move on for time. I want to get to kind of the end part of the practical exercise, which is where often when I'm using big picture, there will be a heading on a session and it'll be growing the team around the customer, and it feels like we're going around the houses a bit to get to where you want to get to. And sometimes you've got to make sure that you kind of evidence that you will get to where you're going, but we are all about growing the team. So once you've got that view of the customer journey, what you can then start doing is like growing arms and legs a little bit. So if you imagine what we've done so far is we focused down a bit like the lights on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. They've all gone like that and they're focused down on the customer journey. And then what we do, that's like convergent thinking. What we're now going to do is like open it out a little bit. What the clarity on the customer journey allows us to do is to bring in the different big picture symbols. So we'll start with the team symbol, which is the red one, which is if you've got the prop, you've got the little red symbol. You've only got one of them, but in big picture terms, beautifully. Right up to the camera, Lisa, for Tim. Look at that collaboration right there. Amazing. Tim's got a red croc and you've got a red team symbol. That's amazing. That means Tim's got team crocs, but that's just the weird way, I think. That'll entertain me all weekend, that point. So we've got that. We've got a technology blue symbol, which you haven't got, but I have. And we've got a process symbol. So what we do, hopefully, as an insight, it won't be too big a jump for you to trust me that once you have clarity on the, let me just bring it up. Once you got clarity on the customer journey, and there are a few steps into this compounded, but I just want to demonstrate how it works. You then go to the other big picture symbols. People are already in the room used to taking a symbol, understanding what it means, and articulating themselves with their colleagues to make their own connections. And this is where the thing comes alive, because what you're doing is giving people a language in which to express themselves and make connections. So you give them, for instance, a few of the team symbols. So what you're doing, and I'm going to speed up a little bit here, what you do is you look across that customer journey and you think, how do we structure the team to face off to that customer journey in all different ways? You know, have they got the right competencies? Are they trained up? Are they resourced up? Have they got an appetite? Do they have the time? You know, any resources they need, it's about being in the right place at the right time with the right resources to be able to do their job. So everywhere that red symbol goes anywhere near the customer journey, that needs to be brought into the consideration as to whether that team is set up to be built around the customer journey, which is now defined. That's the team symbol. I would bring in two other symbols. You've got the measure symbol there, which is the black background with the white cross. if you have the customer journey defined and you have the teams growing and building around it, it's a great conversation to have, to think about what are we doing to measure whether we're being effective or not. And when it comes to people, that doesn't have to be a crude, very cold number. It could be something around the feedback. It could be something around that passive phase. When they move out, the customer moves on. How long is that? How do customers then react when they've finished the product or service? When do we hear from them again? Can we do something about that to kind of not interrupt it, but provide them with a bit of value in that period? Going up the chain to the awareness and informing stage, how are we measuring that? And I know we've got the kind of normal leads and conversions, but I would say it takes on a different perspective when you're looking at it from a customer and team and then measure, because the brain likes to, irrespective of your background, the brain likes to kind of connect things together, and that's where the magic comes. And that's my belief, that if you give people the right tools and the right key elements of the business in the right environment, they will start making their own connections. And I think that's where employee voice and engagement for me is in the future. It's genuinely giving people the tools, and these are not surveys and not question and answers. These are real things that they can make and do with themselves, just as you're doing now and I'm facilitating through. Moving it on to another two symbols, there are kind of six symbols in the big picture approach. There's the technology and the process symbol. You can see there the blue technology symbol and the black box of the process. What I'm doing there is I'm saying, if you're growing a team with all its various characteristics and its features, and you've got the measures right and you've got the customer journey in focus, what technology and what processes do you need to support that team? So it's about growing a team as individuals, but also giving them the structure around it and the support of the technology and the processes to do that. And I would finish off by saying the last two symbols we have in big picture are the challenge and the opportunity symbol. And there's no better moment in a session when they then identify for themselves to achieve what they want, to get to where they need to as individuals and a team as a business. What are their key challenges and what are their key opportunities that they themselves find? I call it Windowsill Facilitation, because often by this point the big picture practitioner is sat on the windowsill watching them have it out, so to speak. It can be quite emotional and sometimes entertaining moment to let them find their top three challenges, because they've only got three challenge symbols. So they might think they've got 8, but as we know, time is limited. So they have to prune it down. Like we use a scarcity, because they're physical props, we use a scarcity. So I'm going to summarize now, because we're kind of bang on time. We've had a little kind of an insight there into how big picture can be used for building a team around the customer, to remind you what is on offer here, to be clear, and the kind of takeaways. What I hope I've given you is a bit of a different way of thinking, and maybe a little earwig, as a colleague of mine used to say, about if you're in a conversation wherever you are and they're talking about building the team around the customer, it feels like there's a few steps there to go around. So there's about clarity of who the customer is, how the customer journey lays out, then going through the kind of the team, the measures, the technology and the process. It's stepping through that. So you've got an immediate kind of little story to tell wherever you are about how that can work. We do provide the kind of kits to support that. We run the workshops and the programs, but it's all very much about helping you to help yourself. So in the new year, there'll be an online training platform which you can go on and learn and find out how to use the kits. So it's a bit like self-learning. This is kind of how I believe, and I've got experience in how it can work, and I like working with others who have those same values, that we genuinely think employees have a lot of the answers to the future challenges that businesses are going to face. And I'm looking for people to work with and who want to get to there in the same way without telling people. what to do. What I'd like to do as a follow-up is I will share with you a board in our Big Picture app where you can put any notes that you've made on your paper in front of you. You can put the content in, and then as a bit of a follow-up, if you've got a specific issue or challenge that you want to talk through one-on-one, I normally do it on the middle Fridays between webinars. If there's a particular point that goes along the lines of, well, you say to me, you did this and use that example, how would it work in this situation? That gives me the chance to just spend another half an hour with you going, well, try this and try this. It's very much he's a different way of thinking, and often we're all the same. When there's a different way of thinking about something, it sometimes just unblocks and sparks off a new idea in a kind of lateral thinking kind of way. So I'll pause there. I'm pretty much bang on. I like to leave it open so you feel like you've had the opportunity to say, is there anything you'd like to reflect on or suggest or challenge even?
Can I mention one thing, Martin? I think that's, you know, when you had about smash the hierarchy, yeah. In some organisations, when the hierarchy goes, it just causes insecurity. If you said unlock that, it'd be a more positive. It's one of those achieve the same thing, but unlock releases potential.
Excellent.
Smashing something down can cause. I thought that's just, and it just causes concerns.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tim.
I suppose on top of that, in terms of the hierarchy, it's understanding what the customers understand the hierarchy is. Because like you said, if you have a fancy organogram that shows who's in charge, the customer's not really that bothered who's higher. Well, I wouldn't have thought that they're that bothered who's further up the line. So it's finding the right people to have the relationships with the customers, whether it follows the path of the organogram or not.
Yeah,
fantastic.
Yeah, it feels like it's a different view as opposed to getting rid of the hierarchy or anything like that. It's you know, showing it from the customer's viewpoint, you know, or something like that. You know, it's you know, you're not actually changing that organisation. And as Tim said, absolutely, you know, and particularly in the public sector, you know, it's kind of, you know, what do you mean? I've taken this long to get this many people below me.
What I've just by listening to all of your feedback there, just remind me that I love a good book reference. I always like to throw in a book reference because that's how I get my reading matter. And there's a book called Sapiens, and I don't know whether you know of it. It's a really good book. I can't remember who read it, but in there it talks about pretend structures. And what's just struck me is, we touched on this theme earlier, we have real people at the center of the business in terms of customers, and also real people as employees. As Tim pointed out earlier, it's about that experience of both customers and employees. But we're in this kind of pretend structure, and it talks a lot about the success of man and Sapiens and why we've kind of evolved and developed. We've got these pretend structures, and that organogram, I guess, in a way is a pretend structure. And this is about just seeing it, as Sharon said, in a slightly different way so that we can have more clarity about the customer experience. So maybe it may change some of our behaviours and the way we kind of hand off the customer from one to the next department. So there's something maybe in that around pretend structures. I think like the legal entity and the organogram are probably two examples of that. They exist on the page, but they don't exist between two people when they're interacting. So there we are. Anyway, that's a lovely point to finish on. I would thank you very much for your time. This will be recorded. I will ask for a little bit of feedback afterwards. I'd love you to tell your friends to maybe join the next theme. I try and pick themes that are interesting and topical and future proof. We've got one around remote facilitation as an example. So please look out for me running some more, and I'd love you to come on anymore. You've been fantastic participants, and whatever you're doing this weekend, I wish you a lovely one, and I will catch up with you all in due course.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Take care, Martin. Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thanks, Martin.
Bye, Tim, Sharon.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.